I'm Hannah Riley-Bowles. I'm the research director here at the Women in Public Policy program, where we are devoted to closing gender gaps in the areas of economic opportunity, political participation, health, and education. And we're excited for today's speaker, who's going to be a little bit of a change of pace from our academic talks, and a very welcome one, actually, because a lot of times we have our academics, and we've had a lot of experimentalists this year, and people doing archival research, and then there's inevitably the question about kind of what does this look like in organizations, and how would you actually make it work? And finally now we have someone to complement that, who's actually worked in organizations on these issues, and really big ones, and with strong personalities. And so I'm very eager for this talk. So Stephen Frost, who's a WAPPP Fellow, was the head of diversity and inclusion at the London Organizing Committee of the Olympic Games and Paralympic Games. His job there was basically incorporating diversity and inclusion at all levels of the games. And right now he's writing a book about that experience. But I also want to highlight that this is not the first time that he has played an important leadership role on diversity issues. And he's worked with organizations as diverse as J.P. Morgan Bank, the Royal Navy, and the Manchester City Football Club. And so we have someone here whose experience we're all really going to want to tap. And so I will not take up any more time. Thank you all. Thank you for being here.
Hannah, thank you very much. It's very kind, especially since you haven't heard me speak yet.
I didn't lay claim. He's a graduate of the Kennedy School too. MPP.
There you go. There you go.
See, so for those of you, you get to look forward.
There you
guys do cool things after you graduate.
Oh yeah. So thank you all for coming as well. Before I start, I guess I should give you 3 caveats or points of clarification, if you will. First up, I'm British. So if there is anything I say which is completely unintelligible, just give me the benefit of the doubt and assume I'm more articulate and witty than I actually am. Second up, this is not just about gender. This is about inclusion. I'm going to talk about disability, about race, ethnicity, about sexual orientation, about age, belief, and indeed socioeconomic differences as well. And we wrap that up in terms of inclusion and how we try to change the culture of an organisation by work on inclusion. And the third point I wanted to stress, as Hannah's already said, is that I'm not an academic. Yes, I did the MPP program here at the Kennedy School. Yes, I did some work at Oxford. But I'm talking today as a practitioner. I spent 5.5 years as Chief of Staff and as Head of Diversity and Inclusion for the London Organising Committee for the Olympics and Paralympics. Before that, as Hannah said, I've worked with some other interesting organisations, and I speak very much as a practitioner today with all the messiness and reality that goes along with that. I was going to play you a quick film by way of introduction. How many people here feel they really know the Olympic Games and the history of the Olympic Games? So I should play the video. It's only 2 minutes, but it's probably worth doing it. It's a very interesting little take.
The Olympics started way back in ancient Greece, where athletes competed in the buff and corporate tie-ins were almost unheard of. After that, people would try and bring the games back, such as in revolutionary France, Liverpool, and Wenlock. And the thoroughly French Baron Pierre de Coubertin was so stirred by Wenlock's giddy heights that he founded the proper Olympics, holding the first in 1896 in a far less monarchy Greece. The next few games were just sideshows to bigger things, but they did see women's events introduced and the first Paralympian winner, a wooden-legged gymnast with 3 gold. And in 1912, Sweden finally stepped in and assembled an affordable and well-designed Olympics. But just when things were on track, trouble in Europe got the 1916 Games cancelled. And Germany weren't invited to the next Games, having recently paid the hosts a rather unwelcome visit. The Olympics had a swift revamp, launching big brands like the Olympic rings and the flame. Fun fact, the torch relay started in 1936 when it was passed to Nazi Berlin. This was Hitler's big fascist party, where he tried to ban black and Jewish athletes. US runner Jesse Owens famously won 4 gold medals, ruining Hitler's bash, and we all had a war. 48 saw those sworn sporting terms meet up in a flatboat London for the topically titled Austerity Games. Germany, Japan and the Soviet Union stayed home. Meanwhile, in nearby Aylesbury, injured war veterans held an archery contest, which went on to become the Paralympics. Then, after a fairly dull 50s, the 60s were much more exciting. Not only did the game see its first black African champion, they also saw the Black Power salute performed on the winner's podium. There was tragedy in the 70s, with 12 murdered in the Munich massacre. Among the dead were 11 members of the Israeli Olympic team. The 80s saw lots of spiteful snubbing, with the US and the Soviets taking it in turns to stand each other up. Since then, the 90s and the noughties have seen far fewer boycotts, with a schmoozy bunch all showing up to the Beijing Olympics despite China's track record. The Games have also proved economy-bustingly expensive of late, so good luck, Britain, for 2012. We're all in this together.
There you go. Hopefully that gave a little whistle-stop tour of the last 100 years for anybody who wasn't familiar with the fact that the torch relay started in Hitler's Germany in 1936. To try and give you some context before I go into the main part of this presentation, I thought I'd just kind of point out 7 points which my boss, the Chief Executive Paul Dighton, had used to describe the life and the transition of an organising committee. An organising committee of an Olympic Games and Paralympic Games is a very unique beast. And according to Paul, there are 7 stages in the organising of such a Games. Stage 1 was celebration, when we won the Games, because Paris was supposed to win them. London wasn't supposed to win the 2012 Games, and it was a surprise and a celebration. Stage 2 was then shock, when you looked at the host city contract and you realised what you had committed to. Stage 3 was then despair, when you thought we can never do this, followed by stage 4, which was of course the search for the guilty. Who got us into this mess? Stage 5 was the persecution of the innocent, followed by stage 6, which was celebration when it all went swimmingly well, as it kind of did last summer. And the final stage, as anybody who's worked in corporations or academia may or may not relate to, the final stage, stage 7, is the glorification of the uninvolved. And I will attempt to go through that now. What I'm just going to do over the next 30 minutes is do what we tried to do with colleagues at the London Organising Committee over 5 years. And that is take people through a 3-stage process. That process is about understanding. What are we talking about when we talk about inclusion? It's about leadership. How do we lead on these issues? And it's about delivery. Show me the money. What's happened as a result? So understand, lead, and deliver. And we had 5 years to do that. And I'm going to try and do it in 30 minutes with yourselves. If there are any points of clarification, please do shout out. But if there are any questions, perhaps leave them to the end, because I'm going to put a lot of stuff on the table. So let's start off with understand. This was picked up in the video about the 1968 Mexico Olympics, when 3 chaps, Peter Norman, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, did what they call the human rights salute, more commonly known as the Black Power salute, and it resulted in them being expelled from the Mexico Olympic Games. I make this point simply to point out that diversity and inclusion is not a new topic for the Olympic Games or for London Organising Committee. And it's a point I tried to reinforce to colleagues at every opportunity, that this wasn't a new idea, right? This is actually in the history of the whole movement. Similarly, it was in the history of the bid. London put forward a very particular bid, contrasting quite sharply with Paris. Paris was actually the most technically excellent bid and was no doubt be a technically superb Games. But London said something different. It said that actually we wanted to re-engage with audiences that had been switched off or turned off or not even spoken to by the Olympic movement. And this resonated with the Olympic movement because they realised that for their own self-preservation, their audience was getting progressively older, it was getting progressively less diverse, and it was being progressively less like the world around them. If they wanted to retain their credibility in the modern age, they'd better engage new audiences. So we unashamedly used some wonderful icons to say that, well, give it to London and we will give you that diversity. We will give you a Games which really is everyone's 2012. And throughout the education process with colleagues, we referred to inspirational icons such as Mandela and later Tutu, rather than relying on a compliance kind of driven approach. We pointed out as well in understanding that D&I and diversity inclusion was in the IOC Charter and the Paralympic Charter. Again, this wasn't new. This was already part of our job. It's just we hadn't really been doing it very well until now. So when you look at the IOC values of excellence, friendship and respect, and you look at the IPC values, the International Paralympic Committee values of determination, courage, inspiration and equality, you can see that's pretty good fertile ground for trying to do a diversity inclusion programme. And it begs the question why we hadn't really done more to date. The London vision was to use the power of the Games to inspire change. Again, another fertile starting point for doing a D&I programme. And so D&I, diversity and inclusion, was from the start tried to design to be a key differentiator of the London Olympics. We could never be bigger or more wow than Beijing. We could never be new like some other countries were. We'd done it twice before. But what London could offer was the most diverse, the most inclusive games that had been done yet to date. So we had to really define what does success look like. And again, if you take the people that I was working with, I was fortunate that I was employee 53 and we increased our size to 200,000 colleagues, so I was in pretty early on. But you can see really that we had a real education challenge. I've gone through some of the ways we tried to understand and educate this understanding around diversity and inclusion, but really we had to make it simple. These are busy people coming from very diverse backgrounds with very different views about the world. So we settled on this image. It's an image of the England football team supporters with one person from every single country in the world wearing the England football team shirt. Very simply, it's diversity and it's one team. So in a very, very simple way, we tried to talk about inclusion more than just diversity, and we tried to talk about the business case for action, that this was a better team than a homogenous team, and that basically there was a moral story to tell as well as a business case for action. We positioned diversity inclusion from the start as really unapologetically, this is part of the day job. You know, the question is not why should you do this program, the question is why wouldn't you do this program? When we're not going to really ask you for much more money or much more time, just an intellectual engagement, why wouldn't you do that? And so the understanding that we've done, we kind of tried to build on progressively and explicitly not do training, but do lots of conversations. One of the conversations we had in talking to people was that diversity inclusion didn't just happen. Right? It wasn't good enough that you had gay friends or black friends or you were really right on or voted one way or the other. Congratulations. The fact was, what have you actually done about it? I joke with colleagues and directors at LOCOG, the organising committee, that we suffered from what we call guardian reader syndrome. And I showed you a clip at the beginning, which was from the Guardian newspaper, which is a left-leaning liberal newspaper in the UK. And I said that we had guardian reader syndrome because everybody was reading this paper and basking in their wonderful liberalism, but that didn't actually hire poor people. It didn't actually deal with racism or homophobia in the workplace, and we actually needed to, shock horror, do something. So it doesn't just happen. And Gilbert Feli is the wonderful chief executive of the IOC, and Javi Gonzalez is the wonderful chief executive of the IPC, and we had them both around the table with our directors, majority of female directors, and said, this is how London wants to do it. It doesn't just happen. Are you okay with that? And they said yes. They realised that the normal relationship is very much top-down from the IOC to the organising committee, and this is one issue where we were going bottom-up. We were going to say, this is something we want to do, and we'd love your blessing on it, if not your wonderful financial support. To reinforce this point about it doesn't just happen, I showed as many colleagues as I could the following two images. This image is the view that I had at the Beijing Paralympic Games in 2008. I was lucky enough to be in the VIP seating, and I had a wonderful view of the sitting down volleyball in the Beijing National Indoor Gymnasium. I was with my colleague, who is a wheelchair user, and this is the Paralympic Games. So this is my view of the action. And this was his view of the action. And I found it somewhat ironic that a wheelchair user at the Paralympic Games couldn't actually see the sport. So the point was not lost on all our architects and designers and venue managers that it doesn't just happen. We really have to think about this deeply and understand it and not take it for granted. So that's the first point really I wanted to make about understanding. I say it's a process that we did over many years, and it's a process obviously I'm doing now in a matter of minutes, but it kind of worked. People started to get that actually we weren't asking them to do anything which wasn't outside their day job. We weren't asking for a lot of money or time, but we were asking for a conscious commitment to it in every decision that they made. The second stage, therefore, we went on to was lead and leadership. Now, many of you may know this woman. I don't know if you do, but Sarah Attar was the first Saudi woman to run in Olympic Games, one of the first 2 Saudi women ever to compete in the Olympics, and she made history in London by running the 800 metres. And even though she was 30 seconds behind the penultimate last person, she got a complete standing ovation and a completely biased coverage from the intercom at the Olympic Stadium. But lead was something we were asking everybody to do. And so we took a rather different approach, I guess, to it. And we tried from the start to emphasise to people, whether they were on the reception desk or in the boardroom, that this was not about management. This is about leadership, which anybody at any level could exercise at any time. And again, to try and break the mould, to intervene in people's existing perceptions of leadership, we managed to persuade Desmond Tutu to come over to join us for a day. And he talked about leadership, and he talked about what he'd like to see the London Organising Committee do. I mean, Hannah's obviously does wonderful work in this area, but I definitely used what I learned at the Kennedy School in a lot of this work, particularly the adaptive rather than the technical leadership, particularly really around thinking about who we wanted to use to make that intervention. And for me, Tutu was perfect because he was a very inclusive figure who reached out to people who we really need to get in the conversation, particularly straight white men, like our Chief Executive, Paul Dighton, and our Chair, Seb Coe. So Desmond Tutu launched the Leadership Pledge, which was a very simple embodiment of our ideals. And this was a pledge which we offered up to all of our people on a voluntary basis, not on a compliance basis, not on an audited basis, but on a voluntary basis. And yes, we had Desmond Tutu launch it, and that might have been one of the reasons why 96% of our people signed it, but they did so of their own volition. And it really committed them to 3 things. 1, to thinking about diversity and inclusion when they hired. 2, to thinking about diversity and inclusion when they purchased goods and services. And 3, to think about diversity and inclusion when they delivered and designed services for the public and for the customers in the games. And we got all of our people at that stage into a room on the 4th of February 2010, and Archbishop Tutu talked to them. And he used his imitable, comical, humorous style to kind of get rid of people's defences and preconceptions and to talk to them about diversity and inclusion. We also took the heads of department, the critical middle management, which are usually so difficult to get to in an organisation and are often the blocker in any change programme, and got them in a room, particularly to have a bit more one-on-one time with Archbishop Tutu. And I noticed in preparing this presentation that at that time, the 4th of February 2010, there were 46 heads of department. So these are not the 12 directors, this is the next level down. And of them, only 26% were women. There were only 12 women at that time, 12 out of 46. But it's interesting to note that of all of those people there, they were all ecstatic, they were all smiling. And I know who went on to hire diverse teams. And the majority of the team there who were men actually did a good job in terms of hiring diversity, and particularly gender diversity, as a result of this day going forwards. To help people in their leadership challenge, we set up a series of infrastructure.
Actually, can I pause you on that?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I 100% got what you were saying. What you were saying is that for the women, this is more obviously, special, but you're saying that the guys were very much on board too, or what was your point?
My point on that really is, I'm going to come on to some results and some statistics, which will show you that we did pretty good on gender equality. Mm-hmm. But at that point, only 26% of our level 2 people were women. And, it wasn't a given, therefore, given how the hiring was going to work, the ramp up from that level to 200,000 people, that we weren't going to end up with, 150,000 men and only 50,000 women, we actually managed to skew that back. But at that point, it wasn't a given. So we set up some infrastructure to help people in their leadership roles. We set up a diversity board, which is something that a lot of corporations do. But we got our chief executive to chair that. And it was comprised of directors as well as external members representing all strands of diversity. And that was a useful forum to oversee all the work that we were pushing through there. We brought in our sponsors, we brought in government officials and other stakeholders to look at accessibility. We had diversity action teams and working groups for the staff where anyone at any level could get involved. So we had LGBT groups, we had disabled groups, we had a black staff network. We had champions who were on a management committee, and they were all accountable for championing a strand of diversity. And again, I'll come on to that in a minute. But one of the most interesting things which worked was functional area benchmarking. And we actually analysed every single department of the organisation every single month on their recruitment against every single strand of diversity and inclusion. And that was really interesting because we didn't set quotas. We didn't even set specific targets, but we did aggressively share information. And a very interesting kind of competitive dynamic resulted, where particularly some of the male-led departments didn't like being at the bottom of the league table. And there was a lot of competition with a diverse supply chain to hire diversely. And I'll come on to that in a minute. But this is a very interesting dynamic that happened. Here's our diversity board visiting the stadium. We met regularly and made sure that we kind of kept that momentum going. Here's some of the challenges we had in terms of leadership when we kind of perhaps had a bit of a wobble. That understanding which I've talked about and the leadership I've talked about so far were critically important, because when things got tough, we had to kind of hold steady and get people to kind of hold the line and not change course. There's a delightful newspaper in the UK called the Daily Mail that took great pleasure in absolutely trying to attack at the core our approach to diversity and inclusion. And the more success we had, the more they stepped up their campaign. And the more profile and kudos we got for our work, the more they stepped up the campaign. And so this is how they started it. They got hold of some of our volunteers and they interviewed them and got the training book that we provided to them and tried to pretend that we were creating the most politically correct, gone mad Olympics ever. And then they stepped up with some nice personal attacks on yours truly, where who knew our diversity targets were going to make us go bust and drive up the bill for the Olympics. This kind of stuff was tough, but we managed to hold steady and we managed to kind of get through. So, deliver. This is the bit I guess I need to spend most time on and where most of the discussion is going to be around. Understand, lead, and then deliver. We didn't really have a problem with motivation in our team because every single day the clock was ticking down. And every single day we'd know how many days to go, how many Tuesdays to go, how many hours to go, how many board meetings to go until the actual games. And being late wasn't an option. Missing a deadline wasn't really an option because at 8 p.m. actually 2012, on the 27th of July 2012, the games would start no matter what. And so we had to think quite intelligently, I guess, of how we were going to intervene in this project to make it happen on time. And so on the left here, if you look at what we break down as strands, if you will, of diversity, we looked at gender, and of course gender identity as well. We looked at disability, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, belief, and a social status based on address or postcode or zip code, and also previous unemployment. And we took those kind of aspects of diversity, and we looked at how we could intervene in 3 areas in the project. The first was in workforce, by hiring brilliant, diverse talent. The second was in the procurement process, how we could actually make our supply chain as open as possible. And the third was in terms of service delivery, how we could exceed the expectations of our 9 client groups. So this project, in its complexity, was kind of divvied up in those 3 ways for the purposes of inclusion. I'm going to go through each in turn, starting with the workforce. The challenge on workforce was quite immense. We had to recruit up to 8,000 paid people, up to 70,000 volunteers, and up to 130,000 contractors in a 4-year period of time. But actually, the ramp up was exponential, and the majority of that recruitment happened in 2012. So we had to be ready. And if we weren't ready and we didn't get the people on board, it would be a bit of a flop. So we looked at intervening on the supply side and the demand side for labour. And on the supply side, we worked with hundreds of community organisations and credible professional networks, Women in Science and Technology, gay professional network, so forth, and asked them not to lobby us, but to come up with recruitment action plans on how they could supply talent at specified numbers by specified times. We did a series of outreach events and did a lot of networking events at our offices, and we launched 3 programs in particular. Access Now guaranteed an interview to any disabled person that met the criteria for a job. Attitude Over Age reached out to older as well as younger workers and was launched by a rock concert by the Zimmers, whose average age was 75 and whose lead singer was 92. And we also launched Action on Inclusion, which worked and reached out particularly to black youth in East London. We had communication packs, we had so many forms of outreach, the aim being to get that supply at the right diversity and the right volume to be there available when people needed to hire, and to remove the excuse from any hiring manager that they couldn't find diversity in the shortlist. Because yes, they could, because there it was. On the demand side for labour, we had the functional area benchmarking, which I'll mention in a couple of slides. And another thing we had, which was really, really useful, was talent pools. One of the real concerns of the recruitment team was having enough labour at the right time to fulfil our mission. And so in reaching out to all these diverse groups over a 4-year period, if we found great talent that wasn't right for that particular job, we'd invite the candidate to join the talent pool. And that talent pool would be maintained and nurtured over time, so that when we actually did need to hire at volume, they were already pre-screened, diverse, quality candidates there available. And when you look at the ramp up, particularly in terms of ethnicity diversity, it's a very dramatic increase in the final few months. The reason being that we emptied our talent pools at the critical time. We had compulsory training, we had compulsory inductions, the leadership pledge, which I've mentioned. We monitored and measured as much as we could. Every month we monitored and tracked all strands of diversity, all stages of the recruitment cycle and so forth. And so these supply and demand side interactions, we hope, were intelligent interventions in the labour market to create a more diverse outcome. This is an example of how every month we did our tracking. Take, for example, gender. This is the month of November 2011, quite late in the game. In that month, we know that 14,080 total people applied for jobs, of which 7,138 were women. 61 preferred not to say. We know, therefore, how many were interviewed, how many were offered, and how many were accepted. So every month, we knew whether we were behind or on track in terms of our target zones. We did that for every strand, by every department, every month. We simplified it and shared this information amongst all the directors and heads of department in a monthly report. So here again you have the types of diversity, or the strands of diversity, with a point of accountability. These were the management directors that were responsible for championing that strand. We then had the number that applied in a particular month, the number who accepted in a particular month, and the rolling year to date. So again, that gave a snapshot, a dashboard at any point in time how we were doing. So again, to use the example of gender, here you can see that in September 2011, 49% of the people that applied to us were women. But actually in that month, only 43% of the people that were accepted into roles were women. So therefore we were red, we were under target for that month. But actually the year-to-date total was 48%. But it gave you this snapshot and this real-time information on how we're doing in terms of creating a diverse workforce. These target zones here on the right were all based on the London labour market, and were basically based on the demographics of who was employed in London. This is the benchmarking that we used. So again, every month we ranked every department, and we ranked them, for example, in this case in disability, but also in gender and so forth. And again, nobody liked being at the bottom of the league table. We didn't set quotas or targets, we simply shared the information, but nobody liked being at the bottom of the league table. And again, when we had this supply chain coming on board, we had the volume and the quality diversity there, what happened was the directors and senior managers put pressure on the hiring managers to make use of this talent pool, to make use of the guaranteed interview scheme, to talk to the diversity inclusion team. And my team were very happy that by 2010, 2011, they were not having to chase anybody in the organisation. They were chasing them. And that was a really helpful dynamic that worked. So by the end, this is the result that we ended up with in 2012 for the Games. Across all of our major diversity target zones, we met or exceeded our target. When you look at the face of London 2012, and you look at the people that were in uniform, 90% of those people were disabled. 40% of those people were from an ethnic minority. To put that in context, 9% of the UK identifies as an ethnic minority. 5% of those people identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. 36% of those people were under 30. 15% were over 50. One of our torchbearers was 101 years old. We got extra insurance for that one. 46% of our people were women. And that gives you a kind of a snapshot of the team that put on the Games. It was, in any shape or form, a very, very diverse and interesting and great team. In addition, 39% of the people that we hired by the end of the day had been previously unemployed before they'd applied to us, and 24% were from the local 6 host boroughs. That's the 6 kind of poorest boroughs in London. So it was a pretty interesting mix of folks. This is the volunteer team at Beijing. And I spoke quite a lot to colleagues in Beijing to try and get some kind of benchmark for London, which was and wasn't helpful. But they had 1 million volunteers, of which 67 people were disabled. And that was great for Beijing. We had 70,000 volunteers, of which 9% were disabled. And the diversity, of course, I've been through before. But this is a woman called Mary who sent me this photograph a few weeks ago as a memory of her time as a games maker in London. That's the workforce. I should also go through procurement. Procurement being the supply chain, which I knew nothing about 5 years ago. The Kennedy School had not prepared me at all to deal with procurement. But actually, what I initially thought of as quite a boring and dull topic actually ended up being one of the most critical areas of intervention in creating a diverse and inclusive London 2012. The reason being that, our procurement team were the people who bought all the stuff, were the people who wrote all the contracts, and the people who could influence all of our suppliers and labour providers in particular to do or not do certain things. So the challenge here was to come in under £1.1 billion, about $2 billion, and create a transparent supply chain, ensuring opportunity for everyone. Again, being in at the start, we had a conversation with the procurement team, and Jerry in particular, the procurement director, to say, look, we get the commercial imperative. We get that we have to come in under budget or we're kind of screwed. We've got to do that. But we think that diversity inclusion can help in that process rather than hinder. And here's how. We think that actually, if you put all your stuff online or make it as transparent as possible and allow genuine competition for those contracts, you not only create competition, drive down costs, find new products and ideas that you never even knew existed, you actually open it up to small businesses, to minority-owned businesses, and to people who would otherwise not get a slice of the pie because they wouldn't be on the Olympic roster. And it kind of worked. On the supply side, we put a lot of our contracts on a publicly available website called Compete4, and that had very low barriers to entry. We used a business network and buyer engagement team to do a lot of outreach work all over the country and in poor areas as well. And we also worked very hard to get an award, which we used then in our own procurement to make other suppliers get this award as well. On the demand side, everything I've talked about so far applied to the procurement team as well, the leadership pledge, the training, and so forth. But we also had what's called a joint evaluation group. And rather like we did group interviews for recruitment, which definitely worked rather than one-on-one, and drew a lot of Neris's work, here the joint evaluation group was critical because it was a group of people assessing contracts, not one person, and they had to account for diversity inclusion in that decision making. So we came up with this procurement governance model of where diversity inclusion was a key part of the definition of value for money. So no contract over £20,000 could be awarded until it had been signed off green by the diversity inclusion team. And that was really, really helpful in getting to a situation where contractors had to take our position on diversity inclusion very seriously if they wanted to win contracts. Let me just go on here. We launched a business inclusion charter, which might give you an overview of our procurement approach. The objective of this was to make our own business opportunities accessible. So like I said, putting our stuff online, making it available to all. We then kind of wanted to make the subsequent opportunities, perhaps smaller contracts and more accessible contracts, available to all as well. So we mandated, encouraged our tier 1 suppliers to put their subcontracts back into the system, back onto the publicly available website. And we also raised awareness of diversity and inclusion within our organisations. So here's a kind of idea of some of the results we achieved. Caveat on this is that it's only February. I don't actually have the full computed results yet. But by February 2012, we'd done 91% of the contracts. Again, we measured as much as we could. And we knew, for example, that through our outreach, 24% of all the responses to our contracts on this publicly available website came from women-owned businesses. When we looked at the shortlisted stage, we know, for example, that 11% of the shortlisted organisations were what we call Black, Asian, minority, ethnic-owned businesses. And then finally, at the award stage, we can see how many of our contracts actually went to businesses that are identified as such. A couple of caveats. One, you'll see that actually there's definitely a drop-off in terms of awarding. And when I speak to Jerry about that, his view on that is that it's about capability and the capacity of some of these organisations to actually deliver. But it's also interesting to note that besides that drop-off, we still actually end up with a pretty interesting mix at the end. You know, that 15% of the contracts we awarded from our website went to women-owned businesses. And the declaration rate wasn't actually that high. Only about 2/3 of the businesses told us the diversity information. So we don't know if it was actually even more than that. The gold standard, which I mentioned, is an award that exists in the UK for great procurement and for reaching out to minority-owned businesses and supply diversity and so forth. And it had been around for a number of years, but we were the first organisation to actually get this award. And the importance of that was not getting the award, but having the credibility to ask all of our suppliers to go for this award as well. And in terms of creating change, we actually saw a lot of people going for this award who didn't even end up getting contracts with us, but thought it would be a great precondition to trying to get a contract with us. So trying to instill that kind of idea in the organisation worked quite well. Coming on really to my last point, in this delivery space, recruitment and the workforce, procurement and supply diversity, but also service delivery. This was in many ways the most complex and the most challenging area for us to try and influence change in. There were 57 departments in Lowcock who simultaneously were delivering 26 world championships. There were up to 200,000 people. How do we intervene in that to actually try and get them to take diversity and inclusion seriously, to understand it, to lead in it, and to deliver on it? So we had to inculcate diversity and inclusion across 57 departments and 134 separate venues. We had to exceed expectations for our client groups. And we had to really do this at preferably no cost or even cost reduction. So the way we went about it was hiring a bunch of Kennedy School interns who were very helpful. And we interviewed every single one of the functional areas and asked them 3 questions. The first question we asked was, what are your compliance requirements? So, are you sure you're doing what you need to do in terms of the law? And there were a couple of people who just needed a little reminder in that space. But then the more interesting questions were, number 1, how can you actually strengthen your service delivery through diversity and inclusion? So again, positioning this not as a kind of additional cost, additional program, additional thing to think about, but how can you actually improve what you're already doing by thinking about diversity and inclusion? And a great result for this was the volunteer program, where we could have recruited 70,000 people who normally volunteer, who, by the way, people who normally volunteer tend in the UK to be less diverse, older, certain income group, and so forth. Or wouldn't it be wonderful to actually get that diverse cohort of volunteers who could more adequately meet your language requirements, more effectively interact with the customers coming from all over the world and so forth? So it was a no-brainer for the volunteering team that they wanted to have a diverse volunteering cohort. And the final and most interesting question we asked people was to propose a project that they could excel at to demonstrate inclusion and to deliver on our mission of using the power of the games to inspire change. This didn't need to be an additional project. It could be their core project, but how are they going to do something special about it? And building on Tutu, building on the understanding and the leadership, but also hinting that they probably had a better chance of surviving the budget rounds if they were on a list of inclusive projects, we managed to get 97 submissions. And the 57 functional areas submitted 97 projects that they wanted to be everyone's 2012 projects. And we used cost-benefit analysis and some other stuff to get them down to 22, which we thought we could adequately service and consult on in the time we had available. And these 22 projects were therefore aspects of the service delivery that we could bring alive for diversity and inclusion, that could be real legacy aspects of the London Games. And they cover everything from the uniforms to the Cultural Olympiad, the website, from our event services and catering and food to things like the ceremonies. And I'll just give you 2 examples given the time. Each of these projects had a point of accountability in the functional area and a point of accountability in my team. And those 2 people jointly reported 1 page every month on a very simple red, amber, green RAG status sheet, which went in our monthly report. And that simply said, is this project on track? What are the challenges? What are the successes? And so forth. So the CEO or the directors at any point could look not only how was the project technically on track, but how adaptively or how creatively or how inclusion-wise was it on track. Were we on track to create everyone's 2012? And so if you take, for example, the ceremonies, where Martin, the head of ceremonies, and Mark in my team, who is his point of contact, worked together, we were really, really pleased with how it ended up. I don't know how many people here saw the opening ceremony, but we tried very hard to embed diversity and inclusion in that, whether it was the suffragettes, whether it was the immigrants on the Windrush, whether it was the deaf and disabled children's choir, whether it was, for example, how we demonstrated modern Britain and the internet and it being for everyone. So we tried very hard to kind of convey that on a great scale. Other fun fact, actually, about the ceremonies. When a medal is presented, tradition and protocol has it that the woman carries the flowers and the man carries the medal, and usually a man in a suit presents the medal. And we were very subversive and swapped roles. And so if you look at any of the London presentations, you'll see the man carrying flowers, the woman carrying the medals, and a mixture of people presenting them. So that was something we just snuck through. Another interesting aspect of the London Games, I guess, was what the US media described as women rule. It's very interesting to note, and I don't know how many people already know this, that in terms of the US Olympic team, it's the first time ever in American history that there were more women than men on the US Olympic team. And I have it factually correct, I hope, to say that there were 269 women on the team and 261 men, so 51% female. When it comes to winning gold medals, women on the US Olympic team won 29 gold medals and the men only 17. So they actually took home 63% of the golds. So I hope that kind of says something quite strongly, particularly to the founder of the Olympic movement, Pierre Baron de Coubertin, who you saw at the film at the beginning, who unfortunately wasn't a fan of female inclusion in the Olympics. He said that women's sport was impractical, uninteresting, unaesthetic, and incorrect. So I hope that the performance of the US Olympic team this summer kind of rebutted that somewhat. And Jessica Ennis is now a UK household name. She's a hero in the UK for winning her sport too. Let me wrap up and allow enough time for questions and so forth. I appreciate I've kind of gone at enormous speed through a fairly complex project in 5 years' work. But for me, the point now, and the point why I'm here back at Harvard and writing a book, is really the so what question, right? That was a really great summer. That was a really great project. It was a really amazing experience. But so what, right? What is the legacy potential of this? And my initial thoughts are 4, and I'm hoping that you'll give me some more as well, which can contribute to the book. My first 4 points on legacy really revolve around the points I've covered. The first is workforce. I think we've demonstrated that you can save money and save time and get a more diverse workforce as a result, and really try to challenge this assumption that there isn't diversity in the supply chain. Of course, the talent pools differ for different areas, but actually with a concerted effort on the supply side and some intelligent interventions on the demand side, you can get a diverse workforce. And, I think we've demonstrated that. And I think what's interesting to the recruitment profession, which in my humble opinion so often is behind the curve on diversity inclusion, is that, you know, if you can reduce costs and save time, why wouldn't you look into this? Right? I think an interesting second point on legacy is in the procurement aspect. Again, talking to lots of procurement directors who are overwhelmingly men, why wouldn't you want to look at reducing costs? The real barrier to supply diversity is not the transparency of the supply chain or the increased competition that results or the new innovation ideas that come to you from companies you don't know about. It's vested interests and existing rosters and people that are already on those rosters. And so actually, if that's really the only defense of closed supply chains, then I think there's something to be said for reducing our costs. We came in $150 million below our target cost on our supply chain. And I'm convinced one of the major reasons of that was our approach to going out to the market. A third point on legacy, I think, is in terms of service delivery, how you create an inclusive experience for everyone and how straight white men feel included in that inclusive experience. This isn't about groups. This isn't about people. That by providing low counter heights, right, for serving food at the Olympic Games, that's not just for wheelchair users. It's for any parent trying to juggle buggies and hamburgers and like lost animals, right? It helps everyone. And that providing accessible ramps into venues is not, again, just for disabled people. It actually creates great operational flexibility at the 11th hour when we had some last-minute changes on the creative for the opening ceremony. And I think a fourth point on legacy, which I think is transferable as well to other organisations, is let's not think about this as additional programmes. Right? Let's not think about this as some costly additional programme which has got to be driven in. Let's think about this as simply strategically part of business as usual and taking barriers away. Right? Not creating additional infrastructure, but taking barriers away. And actually by removing barriers such as, you know, sexism, homophobia, racism in the workplace, we have created not simply a more pleasant workplace, but allowed those people to give massive discretionary effort that they wouldn't have otherwise done, and quite frankly survive 4 years of the Daily Mail headlines and 4 years of no real wage increases and be loyal to the project. And that kind of strategy and approach, I think, has definitely got implications further afield. The final thought is just that whenever I spoke to people about this and they said, well, it's the Olympics, isn't it? They would do that. No, the Olympics has never done this. This is the first time an organising committee has done it, and I hope it's not the last time that they do it. And when I look at other corporations that are doing diversity inclusion, I say to them, well, look, you know, you'll never have enough time, you'll never have enough resources, but one thing that you do have in infinite supply, that's free of charge and wholly within your control, is your own capacity for leadership. And here are some ideas you can think about in your own organisation, and wouldn't it be wonderful if some of them were carried on? So I'll stop there. I'd be love to hear your thoughts, questions and comments, and yeah, over to you.
Great, I've got questions too, but I guess more.
So in the US, there's a lot of flack for having US uniforms being made in different countries in the US. How would you respond to that in terms of diversity and inclusion?
So I'm not sure I understand. The question was that uniforms are...
Right, so the US uniforms for the Olympics were made in a different country
Right.
in the US.
Right.
So there was a lot of criticism for that reason.
Right, how would I respond to that? This came up all the time in our supply chain. My own view is that I'm not so worried about that, because the world economy is the world economy, and you know, trying to fit supply chains into kind of new modes of operation for the sake of inclusion or PR isn't really going to cut it with procurement directors or the commercial realities of a supply chain. I'm more interested, I guess, in how you safeguard and ensure the standards are appropriate in that existing supply chain already. We had lots of stuff in London that was made outside the UK and particularly difficult, but some stuff was probably right to be made outside the UK. The UK and the US can never compete in some industries now compared with other parts of the world. The question is not, should you change the location? The question is, how do you influence that system that already exists? Yeah.
So going back to the early stages of this,
Yeah.
beyond the moral imperative to do it, were the motivations based in any way based on the perceived lack of social integration in the UK? And if so, do you think it's going to have any long-lasting effects socially?
No, it's an interesting question. I think definitely, we could make a case that, look, it would be inconceivable, right, for us to have this thing happening in London and the UK and not seek to include people, right? You'd have to be a pretty hardcore anti-diversity inclusion person to kind of pursue that line of thought. I think really there's two aspects to your question. Maybe one is like, how did we kind of get that argument through, and then two is what's the legacy of that, right? I mean, I think in terms of how we got it through, you tailor your intervention to your audience, right? So for a lot of people, the moral argument worked. Look out the window, guys. This is the poorest part of London. Are you seriously not going to engage with these people, right? And the moral argument works. But I think for a lot of people, particularly colleagues at work who were good people, but were under phenomenal pressure, the fact that you could advance an argument based on cost reduction or other operational benefits really hit home. And so I think that was something that got there. So the intervention was tailored to the audience, but I think it was a range of things. And in terms of the overall business case, we focused less on, I guess, more obvious aspects of reputation and so forth, and focused more, for example, on, well, how the hell do we know who can produce a great torch, right? What is a cool torch? And we found a small 3-person owned business in East London, right, that designed our torch, or the people that designed the cauldron with the removable the arms, through our supply diversity networks, right? And I think when you show examples of that it has clear benefits to the project, and it came through really challenging existing thinking, people are intellectually engaged in it. I think in terms of the social legacy, that's the big debate, right? I think there's mixed views on what's going to happen now. I think overall I'm optimistic. When you look at previous games, Atlanta, Athens, right, there's not some pretty, Atlanta's venues now or Athens, not so great, right? I think lessons have been learned, and London really tried hard from the outset to think about legacy. But the people question is interesting, because you're doing a massive intervention in the labour market. And even London's huge global labour market, it's a 200,000 person intervention. And those 200,000 people were laid off within 4 weeks after the Games. So how does that work? The only thing I can be optimistic about in terms of that is that the people that work with us had, on the whole, an amazing experience, had access to an amazing network, and that kind of connectivity that was resulted, I think, has got clear benefit. I know it has clear benefits for those people going forwards in their jobs and roles and so forth. We also upskilled people. We had apprentices. So we did a lot of, I think, capacity building with the people that we had. And we had also a legacy program which guaranteed our people support for the following 2 years in looking for work afterwards. But it's still, yeah.
So I want to jump in with the big picture question. Can I stop? So I'm going to start by telling an academic story very quickly, and forgive me for indulging this, but I think it fits so well with the point that you're just making about persuasion. There was a study, this classic study that was done on in a monastery, and they were basically having like young monks that were given the task of, you have to go give a talk on the Good Samaritan, and then they actually put a Confederate who worked for the experimenter along the way. There'd be someone moaning and groaning, lying down on the ground. And they ran one condition in which they put the young priest or monk or whatever it was under time pressure. Right. And the poor guys randomly assigned to time pressure ran past the Good Samaritan at significantly higher rates than those people who were not under time pressure. But it fits so beautifully with your story. I mean, I love your sensitivity to their state of mind, that, some people just aren't it's not that like priests don't have the capacity for transformational influence, but it's just there are certain contexts in which we are constrained from doing that, and we need to adapt our persuasion to that. Anyways, I love that example that you were just providing. But can I ask you a larger question? This relates to so I've actually been trying to teach about more diversity related stuff in our core courses and talking about integrating in the curriculum. And one of the books that's been influential for me is Martin Davidson's new book on leveraging diversity. I don't know if you've seen this yet. And the idea is that we shouldn't be just counting things and quotas and being politically correct but that you need to really go out and say for strategic reasons, why is diversity going to benefit you? And your argument for this was basically like, you guys made this strategic argument behind why London. Part of your strategic argument is diversity, right? Yeah. And so you have this sort of overarching, you have the overarching leverage of this you know, this would be going to be our strategic advantage, this is why we won this, we have got to kind of follow through on this. But what do you learn from this for organizations like you've worked with in the past, like a JP Morgan or some of these other organizations who don't see the strategic imperative writ large?
I guess a couple of things. One is, you're right in terms of we had a lot of cultural capital we could use strategically to say, guys, we've got to do this. But my boss said that to me every day. He's like, come on, Steve, it's easy. You've got this stuff. Come on. But the opposite is true as well, right? Because actually sport is, in some ways, a disaster area for diversity and inclusion. And some of the people I was having to deal with were absolutely unreconstructed 1960s sexist folks, right? And so there's that stuff which you can see, but there's also a lot of other stuff too. And so it was both. It wasn't a given that we could just use that strategic imperative. But to the JP Morgan point, I would say that, okay, you don't have the rings, you don't have the kind of the moral persuasion of the Olympics, but you have some pretty clear commercial parallels. I mean, let's take, for example, the customer base or the employee base. You know, the idea that, you know, you can keep up with the world around you when you are relatively static in comparison to that world around you is logically doesn't follow, right? So by definition, you have to in some way keep up with that world. And how are you going to do that? Well, it's not a result that, you know, quid pro quo, a diverse person equals a diverse perspective, but let's look at who you've got at the moment, right? And there was a wonderful example with our board when I looked at, you know, the board I haven't mentioned because it was largely all men, and the woman on there, Princess Anne, is not famous for her diversity inclusion work. I think her father, Prince Philip, just said that unless it farts or eat hay, she isn't interested. I think in terms of the board, you know, I looked at them and they were all discussing youth engagement and youth inclusion. And I kind of couldn't help but internally laughing, right, that this board of 50 plus guys were discussing how to engage the youth to fulfill our promise. And so I hope appropriately, just mentioned that perhaps we want to consider, you know, reaching out to young people and perhaps even having a youth board. And we set one up, and we set up a youth board. And that wasn't, again, just something to do. It taught these guys and me a lot, right? I don't know anything about computer technology compared to a 14-year-old guy, right? And it worked. So that applies to JP Morgan. I think also in terms of employees, you know, how do you get that discretionary effort, right? Let's think of another corporation that pays less than JP Morgan, but the paycheck will get you so far. Right? How do you get that discretionary effort? And that discretionary effort is the competitive advantage in the economy. So how do you get that? And I think when I speak to people now after the event, they will say that, you know, one of the things they genuinely love about it is that they met people and they worked with people that they would never otherwise have met. And that was a price experience. And there's lots more. I mean, the business case I'm trying to go over in the book, you know, is about customers, employees, basic math. I mean, Scott Page's stuff, right, from Michigan. All that stuff, I think, applies to JP Morgan as well as it does to this. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. Picking up on Hannah's question, I was wondering what kinds of interactions you had with the board around your effort, your diversity and inclusion effort, and also whether you had any interaction with your sponsors for that.
Sure, no, great.
I suspect JP Morgan was one of the sponsors.
So say that again?
I suspect JP Morgan was one of the sponsors.
It wasn't actually. I mean, in some ways I wish it had been, because they're not the worst. Yeah, we had some interesting sponsors. I won't say anything here, so it's being recorded. But two things. I think the sponsors we tried to engage with formally as well as informally, and we set up a sponsors forum where we invited all the heads of diversity and inclusion from those sponsors. So test number one, did they actually have a head of diversity and inclusion? And about half did, which is a good start. And we invited them all to a forum where we shared our work and our thinking and, you know, shared best practice and what they were going to do. And it simulated some of their own thinking about how they would activate their sponsorship. So Adecco helped us with the talent pool. BMW helped us with adapted vehicles for disabled drivers. You know, Coke and Lloyd's TSB did a lot of work on the torch relay and youth outreach. So we did a lot of work, I guess, through that sponsors forum. And, you know, other sponsors were less, you know, on the journey, and I didn't have the time, right? So there's a mixed picture there. In terms of the board, I think, it was interesting because when you first did diversity inclusion to the board, they were like, but when we just showed them some results. So for example, Tutu, we took him to the board, right? And they were all like little children, right? Which was a great moment to say, and he had a cup of tea with Princess Anne in the corner, and that was a great way of the board, how could they not, stand up for Desmond Tutu? I got told off for interrupting the board meeting, but it was Desmond Tutu, and they loved it. And then the leadership pledge, they loved that as well. They all signed the leadership pledge. So they could be the same as all the staff, and you kind of took them on the journey. And I think, to be fair to them, they got that they were not the most diverse group of people, and they got this was of necessity a diverse project, and therefore they better put some thinking into this. And I think they were just pleased that we had some tools for them to use, and they came along. So the board in the main were actually neutral or helpful in most cases. Yeah. Hi. Who's going first? Oh, yeah.
So you started off your talk by going through the 7 stages. Stage number 7 was glorification. So
Yeah.
I feel like we've gotten a lot of that. I'm wondering if there are things that you wish you had done differently,
Sure.
opportunities that you feel like you missed, things you would do a do-over if you had a chance, things that you thought were great ideas, but
Sure.
in practice that didn't actually work out as well as
Sure,
you thought it would.
sure. I should have taken your question. Absolutely. I mean, hundreds, right? The time we've got, I'll tell you a few. Ticketing. I was really pleased that we worked really well with the ticketing team, but I think we could have limited the number of sessions that people could apply for to fewer, and therefore fewer people would have got a number of tickets, but more people would have got some tickets. What else do I think? I think we could have engaged the sponsors more aggressively. I think we could have made the sponsors pull out their money and resources more, particularly those that were not engaged as much. And there were some big sponsors there who didn't do as much as they could have done. I guess my own leadership, there were times when I just had a bad day and I just didn't do as much as I could have done, and I needed the rest and didn't have that conversation or didn't do that meeting and there's more people who could have got on board. So lots and lots of examples of where we could have done more and didn't. And I think, I could answer your question systematically and go through everything again and say, well, this is where we didn't do as well. But I mean, the ones that jump to mind are definitely in terms of, procurement, perhaps being more aggressive on the contractual arrangements and making some suppliers and sponsors do more. Service delivery, making some of the venue guys do more than they could have done, following up more if they didn't turn up to a training session or whatever. Another speaker after Desmond Tutu to keep the momentum going more. Lots. But is there anything particular that you'd want to...
So those are a lot of sins of omission. Are there any sins of commission, things that you did and then afterwards you thought, gee, that sounded like a good idea, but it didn't work out?
Yeah, training. At the beginning I tried diversity training and I was cringing at the back of the room. I thought, why am I doing this? And it probably turned a few people off at the very beginning. But I didn't do it again. We just had the conversations for them. That was one. No, I mean, perhaps...
Is it the diversity training that produced that first article that you showed us?
No, the first article was in response to our training booklet. So our volunteer... It's an interesting point. When you kind of get to the paid workforce that you directly control, when you get to the volunteer workforce, you're one step removed, and you've got no monetary relationship with these people. And yeah, some of them showed their books to the media. And in the absence of context, they looked at the media how, for example, there was one question where, in terms of transgender issues, we said to people, if you're not sure of the gender of somebody, you just say the toilets are over there, right? You don't ask them, do they want the men's or the ladies? You say the toilets are over there. And the Daily Mail picked up on this and went crazy that we were being all transgender, whatever. So, yeah, we could have controlled that more tightly, I guess, and whatever. But more, there's definitely more. I've got a chapter in the book called Failures, so...
I really like to say at the beginning you showed that on the different types of diversity, y'all did pretty well getting proportional to the London workforce.
Sure.
Was there any internal analysis, too, of sort of where folks were in the hierarchy? Because we know how this happens in political parties, right? You put people on the ticket at the very bottom so they
Sure.
don't get anything real.
Can you speak to that?
No, great question. Yes and no. Yes, we did some analysis of kind of the director level, the heads of department level, the next level. But when we started kind of hiring 1,000 people a week and we got to 200,000 people, the levels started to not to make too much sense. So I can tell you, for example, in the paid staff, that of our 12 directors, there were 5 women. Of our heads of department at this time, it was 26% women, and the rest of the organisation, it was 46% women. But I can't go into more detail towards the end of the games on that. But it is something we were very sensitive to, because I had one comment, perhaps back to failures, talking to a very senior colleague, when I wasn't sure about some of the way the diversity was going. And there were comments to the effect of, oh, don't worry, when we start to hire in that area, you know, and you kind of, oh, so you think you're just going to kind of meet this diversity from certain areas, like security, or like, oh, okay. So that's why we, alive to that, we focused very much on non-stereotypical areas, right? So our venues director, who was a man, really led a lot of gender efforts in the design teams and the architecture teams, right? And so despite the talent pool being 95% male, we ended up with 20% women architects in that area. Hi.
I just have one other question. You said that when London was vying for the games, they used diversity as what sort of had them stand apart from the other contenders and whatnot. How did that come to be? How did the people who were lobbying, I guess those are the people in power too, you know, say, London is so diverse, that is why we are special, that's why you should choose us. How did that then translate to the leadership of the games as sort of this organizing principle for how to execute?
No, it's a great question, because it kind of goes back to Hannah's question in a way, right? That on the one hand, you had this kind of advantage of you'd said this stuff. And I think, if I'm really honest, a lot of it was said in the bid, not knowing or even thinking that we'd get it, right? It was a case of, well, you know, you sit down with a kind of brand consultancy team and you're like, okay, what's different about London, right? Oh, wow, we're diverse. So I think a lot of it was kind of in the heat of the bid, that was what was put forward. But I think there's a lot of genuine commitment too. I mean, you know, Barbara Kasani, who was the chair before Seb, as well as Seb, you know, both thought it was important that we did this. I think in the UK there is a kind of a conversation about diversity and inclusion. There's there's an ongoing conversation. So it wasn't off the wall that we did it. But I think that, you know, winning was a surprise. And therefore, how did it translate? Well, it wasn't a given. And I think we had to make it translate by, you know, using the argument that, well, you said all this stuff, right? They've got to operationalise it now, like, you know, show me the money. And I think, you know, Paul Dyken, the chief executive, Jean Tomlin, the HR director, deserve a lot of credit for that. They were the guys that appointed me and wanted this position and really supported us the whole way through. I think, you know, key external people like Tanny Gray Thompson, who's Britain's best ever Paralympian, they lobbied for this stuff. So I think it was really building that alliance and making sure that it wasn't forgotten in the transition and that it was actually maintained. That said, I think some people at the beginning would have thought, yeah, we're going to do this as our corporate social responsibility, but that's it. They didn't realise that it would really become a big deal and would actually gain a lot of support and actually become a differentiator. So, yeah.
You took us through some steps in the beginning. You said something along the lines of understanding, leading, and being able to deliver.
Yeah.
And I wonder, just thinking about this example and being able to utilize it in other organizations, how would you say is the best way to help people understand why diversity is important? Because I know that in this particular case, you talked about the cost, and you know, having more cost to being able to do this, but I think about it and say, well, diversity to me, for me, and why there's so many obstacles to it, is less about cost and more about power, because people feel like sharing means that they're losing power.
Sure.
So that's why, you know, you can say, you know, if we have diverse perspectives, you know, we'll be better as a company and we'll be more successful, but companies still can't make that work because they feel like if I have people of color, if I have women, it's going to mean that me, whoever I am,
giving something up.
It's giving something up. It's like this power pie. So how do you help people understand that?
So that's the question, right? And if, you know, that for me is like how, that's the question to kind of take on to corporations now using some of this stuff. I'd go back to my earlier point that you tailor your intervention to the audience. So let's assume, for the purpose of your question here, that we're talking about a predominantly white board or predominantly white management team, and they're worried about giving up, right? Like, okay, they kind of might get this intellectually, but it's that I'm having to give something up in order to get this. I think you can play different points, right, according to that team. I mean, for me, in terms of the customers, you know, depending on what the business is, they must get that, like, they don't know certain stuff about their customer base, or particularly they don't know stuff about the new customer base that will be essential to take them on to the next level of their organizational development, right, and their new markets and so forth. I think in terms of their employees, they must kind of, you know, everyone uses the Lehman Brothers example, right? Like that, you know, there was a classic case of groupthink, and, you know, had there been more challenge and diversity of thought on that board, had there been more challenge to the, you know, dominant paradigm at that time, would things have been different? I think in terms of the maths, I mean, I mentioned Scott Page's stuff. You know, that's gone down very well with some of my directors. That when you look statistically at the idea that, you know, diversity can trump ability in certain situations, then mathematically, right, they're like, okay, I'm interested in this. Particularly in more smart industries like banks or like consulting firms or so forth. I think, you know, in terms of the general growth, I mean, I did some work with the World Economic Forum last year on growth, and there's this whole obsession at the moment with growth and, you know, what's quality growth and so forth. And the idea actually that we focus so much on trying to extract value from the margin in products and services. Why don't we do that with our people too? And why do we persist in allowing inefficient, you know, we get rid of inefficiencies over here that we think are a barrier to growth over here, but we don't get rid of inefficiencies in our own people teams, be that outdated attitudes or various biases or whatever, you know, we don't deal with that too. And so all these things, I think, depending on who the audience is, can connect with people. But, sorry.
I would just say that in addition to the power piece, there is also a piece around comfort. And I think that what you're saying suggests that people are willing to be uncomfortable for the success of X company or what have you, and I don't know that is always the case.
But you make it as easy as possible, right? I mean, every day you're doing this work is dangerous. You're walking the line, right? Between how much do you push and how much do you know, on the one hand you've got the activists and groups over here, on the one hand you've got the status quo over here. Where's that line? And to your question on failures, maybe I got that line wrong sometimes. But I think one of the approaches that we took was to make it as easy as possible for the dominant power folks, whoever they might be, to say yes, to sign up, right? Like Desmond Tutu and Sign Leadership Pledge was a very gentle way of giving something up, right? Or, you know, being in a league table but not having a quota was a very gentle way of kind of sharing information. These, I think, are things of where we try to get that balance right, and the time pressure helped us really focus.
This is great. I know I have more questions.
Okay.
We have to end. This is terrific.
Thank you.
Next week, our presenter is Stephanie Herder, who's a PhD candidate in business economics here, and she's going to talk about an integrated model of occupation choice, spouse choice, and the family labor supply. Thank you.